Welcome back, everyone. Hope you guys are doing amazing. Of course, we got Old Britannia here, and we're going to be talking about Schwarzenberg's triumph, the restoration of Austrian power. This has to do mainly around like the revolutions of the 1848 era. Of course, in 1848, you have revolutions happening pretty much all over the European continent. Of course, the famous one in France, but you also have ones that are happening in Prussia, Austria, some violence that tries to precipitate in other places like Italy, Russia, the UK, but it doesn't happen at the same degree. France is obviously the worst of the cases, but let's see how Schwarzenberg triumphed and restored Austrian power. Of course, this is kind of like in between the Maria Theresa's reign, which we've already done videos on. So let's see kind of how this. Actually, what am I talking about? I'm a century ahead. No. This is more or less on this is, way in the future. Way in the future. My bad. Let's go.
In 1848, the Austrian Empire was on the verge of disintegration. Revolt had broken out in Vienna. Hungary had effectively seceded. The statesman that had dominated the empire for the last 40 years, Klemens.
Yeah, of course, Klemens von Metternich, one of the key people in the Congress of Vienna that kind of like created the balance of power after the Napoleonic Wars.
Seceded. The statesman that had dominated the empire for the last 40 years, Klemens von Metternich, had fled into exile.
I can't remember why he did that. Remind me below.
In Italy, the Piedmontese king had declared a war for Italian liberation and invaded the Austrian provinces of Lombardy, Venetia.
Oh yeah, so this is this 1848? Isn't this right when the new emperor took the throne because his dad went insane?
The imperial family surrounding the invalid Ferdinand I had twice been chased out of Vienna and now awaited their fate in Olmütz. To most of Europe, it seemed as if the Habsburg monarchy was about to collapse. In Frankfurt, the recently created parliament eagerly eyed the Austrian lands for incorporation into a German state.
Yeah, they're salivating on that.
Led by the Prussian king. The man that would be tasked with reviving this ancient and crumbling monarchy was a tall, slender, and prematurely aged aristocrat of 48 years, having spent most of his life as a debauched Regency-era dandy in England.
Let's just catch up and see who this guy is, because I've never heard of him. Prince Felix of Schwarzenberg, born on the 2nd of October at Székely Krumlov Castle. Must be a nice place. Begins his military career at 18. And he transfers to diplomatic service, serving in St. Petersburg, Paris, and Turin. So he's been around. Serves as the attaché in London, where he earns his notoriety for an affair with Jane Digby. Don't know who Jane Digby is, but he got some notoriety from that. And then at 48 years old, he's appointed minister president. Interesting.
England. There was little to suggest that the new minister president would be any more successful than his 6 predecessors that year. Yet Prince Felix Schwarzenberg would, in a matter of months, restore the Austrian Empire to a status not known since Leopold II. His first move was to secure the throne itself. The current Austrian emperor was the well-meaning but disabled Ferdinand I.
Yeah, okay. I can't remember if he was like on his way out right here.
Of little use to anyone as monarch. More pressingly, as a crowned king of Hungary, Ferdinand had taken solemn coronation oaths to defend the special privileges of that kingdom, and in 1848 had signed the April Laws, effectively creating it an independent country, in all but name. Whilst the monarch who had made such promises wore the crown, Schwarzenberg was severely restricted in what force he could use to crush the rebellions. So, on the 2nd of December 1848, Ferdinand was persuaded to abdicate in favour of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph.
Yep. Okay. So now we're connecting where I was. So Franz Joseph, and there's a very good series on Netflix that I haven't got around to watch, but I've seen the trailer on that kind of like talks about him and mainly his wife. So let me know if you've seen that. But more or less, very young age to become an emperor. He will live a long life into the 20th century, but very tall task, I would say.
He had been trained to rule from birth by his mother Archduchess Sophie. He was proficient in Hungarian, Italian, Czech, Polish, Latin, French and ancient Greek, already had ample military experience and a propensity for hard work. With a young and dutiful monarch now on the throne who had sworn no oaths, Schwarzenberg could now turn his attention to governing. He had three main tasks upon taking office in 1848. The first was to establish Franz Joseph's authority in what remained of his empire, the second, to regain what had been lost, namely Hungary and the Italian provinces, and finally to re-establish Austrian supremacy in Germany.
Tall task indeed.
Thwarting the rival ambitions of Prussia. Schwarzenberg started with the remaining empire. He set about constructing a strong cabinet around him, caring nothing for nobility or birth status. Despite being from one of Austria's most illustrious families, Schwarzenberg
Looks like John Tyler. Slightly. Like the president, John Tyler.
despised his own class for having brought the empire to disaster. His new Austria would be unrecognisable from Metternich's. Old traditions and constitutional settlements were swept aside. In place for the first time was a single centralised government in Vienna, with no internal barriers on trade, whose bureaucrats' reach was to extend to every corner of Franz Joseph's realm. Even Joseph II could hardly have envisaged something so radical. Schwarzenberg's ultimate aim was for an efficient absolute monarchy, but a constitution had been promised by Emperor Ferdinand in 1848, and thus one had to be promulgated, if only to quieten liberal discontent in the short term. A constituent assembly, recently removed to Kremlin, had been appointed for such a task before Schwarzenberg had taken office. Here, representatives from throughout the empire attempted to work out a liberal constitution. They were eventually able to thrash one out, but it had serious flaws. For example, Article 1 declared all political rights emanate from the people. No Habsburg monarch could have accepted such a statement. The assembly planned to vote through the constitution nonetheless on the 15th of March 1849. On the 7th, Schwarzenberg sent in the troops and dissolved it, arresting various deputies.
Dang. Yeah, very absolutism of him.
The fact this was done in Franz Joseph's name was to add a black mark to the new monarch's record. Earlier politicians like Metternich would never have exposed their sovereign's prestige in this way. Nothing could have better contrasted Metternich's conservatism with Schwarzenberg's ruthlessness. With the farce in Kremlin dissolved, he promulgated his own constitution, largely drawn up by Minister of the Interior Count Stadion. This formalised his centralisation efforts, turning the empire into one vast customs union. It set up 2 elected chambers as a parliament, though the constitution also gave the emperor absolute legislative power through provisional decrees, only to be ratified when parliament was convened, which would of course be at some arbitrary date far in the future.
So, absolute rule.
De jure, Schwarzenberg had his centralised state. De facto, he had his absolute monarchy. In November 1848, General Windisch-Gratz had retaken Vienna for the dynasty. With the capital secure, the Austrian fight back could begin. In Italy, an uneasy armistice had held since the 83-year-old General Radetzky defeated the Piedmontese at Custoza in July 1848. By 1849, the Piedmontese king Charles Albert was watching with increasing dismay as protracted mediation efforts from the British and French did little more than buy Austria time to prepare for the next stage of the war. On the 12th, he restarted the conflict. On the 22nd, Radetzky met the Piedmontese army at the Battle of Novara and defeated it. Charles Albert abdicated. In August, Piedmont offered peace, and Lombardy-Venetia was fully returned to Austrian control.
Of course, Piedmont will be back in the future when, with the help of Napoleon III. But for now, they got to be on the sideline.
The victory in Italy was undoubtedly decisive and reclaimed the richest provinces of the empire for
Right, Lombardy, Venetia.
the Habsburgs. But the wisdom of waging such a campaign is somewhat questionable. The Italians were the only people in the empire that could never be fully reconciled to any form of Habsburg rule. Coming to some sort of accommodation with Charles Albert would have allowed Austria to free up the men needed to crush the Hungarian Revolution without outside interference, and the diplomatic complications that came with it. For now though, the question was settled. Schwarzenberg's other pressing task was to deal with the situation in Hungary. Having revoked the April laws, the kingdom had now fully broken with the Habsburgs, deposing them on the 14th of April 1849. Windisch-Gratz had seized Budapest in January 1849.
Are these just different factions? Like you get gray, purple, yellow?
But in April, he had been forced back by Hungarian troops. For this failure, the man who had largely saved Franz Joseph's throne was ignominiously sacked. For Schwarzenberg, however, it could hardly have been planned better. Windischgratz was one of the last old conservatives with any real influence. Now he was out of the way, the path was open for Schwarzenberg to govern as radically as he saw fit. But first, Hungary had to be crushed. Yet the new commander, von Velden, immediately declared he needed more men. There was only two places they could be found. One option was to settle with Charles Albert in Italy and free up Radetzky's army. This was not even considered. That left only one choice:
Russia.
an appeal to Russia.
Oh, I was about to say. So Russia. Okay. So appeal to Russia. Which is like it's a frenemy. It's a frenemy.
Since the Napoleonic Wars, Austria, Russia and Prussia had been bound by an agreement known as the Holy Alliance. The aim had always been to contain revolutionary movements on the continent and preserve monarchical authority. But few were so naive as to think a rival state would throw away its own men's lives for the sake of so vague a concept. There would always be a bill to pay, and for this reason Schwarzenberg had previously argued against any Russian involvement. Yet, if he wanted Hungary defeated and Italy held, there was no alternative. Nicholas I, the gendarme of Europe, didn't need asking twice. 200,000 Russians were soon marching through the Carpathians, and by August 1849 it was all over for the Hungarians.
200,000 Russians just like that. It's insane how volatile Austria has just been over the last 100 years. It's crazy. I mean, some of you guys are like, yeah, it makes sense, but you know, someone like me that's been reading into it so, you know, skimming the surface and then going deeper in some of these videos, it's just like, wow. It's just a crazy melting pot of volatility.
Almost immediately the problems became apparent. Nicholas, greatest of all European despots, suddenly developed into the model of an enlightened liberal and appealed for clemency for the Hungarian rebels. Schwarzenberg's response was, yes, a good idea, but first we shall have a little hanging. He was not going to be told how to conduct his business by anybody. General Haynau, a brilliant military commander but a complete psychopath, was unleashed upon the population and had 4,600 Hungarians arrested, 1,500 imprisoned, whilst 120 were executed.
I guess you gotta go deep whenever when it comes to reprisals, so it doesn't happen again. Gotta make a deterrent out of it.
Nonetheless, Hungary was now crushed. Government was left to Alexander von Bach, supported by a stream of German bureaucrats that set out to run the kingdom efficiently. With the core empire secure, Schwarzenberg could now turn to his third and final task, the humbling of Prussia. The Frankfurt Parliament, which I won't go into detail about here, had been trying since the outbreak of the 1848 revolutions to unite the divided states of the German Confederation into a liberal constitutional monarchy. The Habsburgs were the traditional leaders of the German states, but with Vienna now establishing itself as the capital of reaction, the Parliament chose to offer the imperial crown of this new country to the Prussian King Frederick William IV. But Frederick William, whilst wishing to expand Prussia's influence, was still at heart a romantic and saw the Austrian Emperor as his liege lord. He thus rejected an imperial crown given to him by election rather than divine right. But Frederick William nonetheless did still hope for some kind of Prussian-led union. This came to fruition in the League of Three Kings with Saxony.
League of Three Kings. Never heard of that. That's interesting. So you got Saxony, Hanover, and Prussia?
Hanover, followed by the Erfurt Union in 1850. The general premise was for a so-called inner union under Prussian leadership within the German Confederation. Schwarzenberg was outraged and claimed it was illegal under the terms of the Confederation. His real problem was, of course, that it extended Prussia's influence at Austria's expense. Thus, with the backing of Russia, he pressured the four other German kingdoms, Hanover, Saxony, Bavaria and Württemberg, to abandon the scheme and instead join Austria's proposal, which was to completely re-establish the German Confederation, as it had been before 1848, naturally under Habsburg leadership. By September 1849, he had succeeded in recreating the Confederal Assembly in Frankfurt. He was now ready for a final showdown with Prussia. Schwarzenberg chose to make his stand on the issue of confederal armed intervention on behalf of the reactionary elector of Hessen-Kassel, having trouble with subjects injured in their constitutional rights. Schwarzenberg, with all the German states that mattered and Russia on his side, demanded Prussian troops evacuate the north of Hessen. In doing so, he effectively trapped Prussia between an ignominious climb down and recognising the German Confederation as a reality once more, or a war she was in no position to fight. In the punctuation of Olmütz on the 29th of November 1850, Prussia chose to back down.
Okay, so why were they in Hesse prior? Was it just to assert their security? I'm not sure about the backstory there. Let me know.
And subsequently agreed to the re-establishment of the German Confederation, effectively unchanged from before 1848. It was an
Was it because of like uprisings in 1848? Is it that simple?
almost dizzying triumph that restored Austrian prestige completely. Those that had pitied the state of the Habsburg monarchy now feared it. In just 2 years, Schwarzenberg had taken an empire on the verge of disintegration and made it once more a great power. Yet, for all the undoubted greatness of these triumphs, each was of an only superficial nature. Piedmont had been defeated, but not crushed, whilst Italians were no more reconciled to the Habsburgs than they had been before 1848.
Yeah, but there's so much going on that you can't go deep in any of these areas. Like, you can't go super deep in... I guess you went kind of deep in Hungary. That's the only deep place you went. So, actually, you did pretty good. They did pretty good, actually, across the board, besides Piedmont, as I think about it. I mean, there's a lot on their plate. There's a lot on their plate.
The Hungarian question, whilst for now solved at the end of a bayonet, only needed an opportunity to rear its head once more. Prussia, though
always been the case.
humiliated, had not been permanently neutered, as Schwarzenberg himself well knew. War would perhaps have been better, he said after Olmütz, and would have bought peace lasting 50 years.
Maybe.
Despite these problems, his skill as a statesman is not in doubt. Had he survived another 20 years, it is hard to see that Austria would have met the same fate that befell her in reality.
I mean, I guess the only thing you could had is better diplomatic support. But besides that, your military is still your military.
Yet in 1852, Schwarzenberg died suddenly from a stroke. Within just 14 years of his death, his work was to be undone. Franz Joseph was not an incompetent in foreign affairs, but he was no match for the twin geniuses of Cavour and Bismarck, spectacularly displayed in 1866, when he failed to decide between an Italian or a German policy. In the end, he lost both. With it, Magyar anger revived, and Franz Joseph was forced to grant an autonomy not too dissimilar from the April laws Schwarzenberg had him revoke. Schwarzenberg's triumph was equal to that of any of the other great statesmen in the 19th century, his legacy worthy only of the worst.
This is eye-opening into like the diplomatic chess that had to been partaked in 1848 to 1852 in the short little time that we had as him as a statesman. But Piedmont, it's an interesting case. You know, you can only... I'm thinking that, like, if you tried to squash them, wouldn't France revolt? Wouldn't France have, like, just went in? I would imagine so. I would imagine so. Hungary, I think they did as much as they could in reason with the 200,000 and the reprisals and all that. I think we kind of skimmed over like the bullet points on the realignment of the Confederacy. But it seems like there's a lot more there when it comes to probably interpersonal conversations and how each one of those particular states benefited from realigning. I think there's more to it, as like I said. But yeah, Franz Joseph is such a young man to entrust. He has to have an entrusted cabinet because he's still picking up the pieces as he's trying to figure this all out. But Austria, like I've said before, what an interesting place in the 19th century into the 18th century. Those 2 centuries alone, such volatility. But there's probably even prior to that type of volatility that kind of like opens the door up for these 2 centuries of chaos. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Old Britannia is a really awesome channel. Like I said before, it kind of reminds me of Historia Civilis in a way, but it's very different. We're just going to keep doing more of this content. I appreciate you guys so much. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out, and bye-bye.